Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. In this video, I shall be debating the motion this House believes that Churchill was evil. So I shall start off as the proposition. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the House. Sir Winston Churchill was evil for myriad reasons, and let me adumbrate them here before I examine each in some depth. First of all, his racialism. Second of all, his warmongering. Third of all, the atrocities that he committed in the course of these wars. And fourth of all, his vicious oppression of subject nations. So, well, let's go through them one by one. But there's a little addendum which is oft overlooked. Spencer Churchill and Churchill, they may not sound the same, but it was the blighter's proper name. Never trust a man who can't even tell the truth about his own name. His surname was Spencer Churchill. So he was flagrantly racialist, expressing dislike for the Irish in his book, My Early Life. What else? And proposing racial discrimination against Indians living in Kenya, saying they come from the very lowest class of coolies and they couldn't be on equal footing with whites. What else? He didn't object to the proto-apartheid that held sway in South Africa at the time, and he said that if Jewish people move into Palestine and boot out the autochthonous people, well, the Palestinians have no business whinging about that because they're just being supplanted by people from a higher civilization. He said that the Hindus were pullulating alarmingly, and Mohammedans had somehow been saved from the doom that was their due. I could go on and on. He went to the United States a lot because he was half American, and he never spoke out against Jim Crow laws, lynchings, things of that nature. So his reputation as an apostle of freedom is overblown, to say the very least. Now, see him as a warmonger. His bloodlust knew no end. He was very eager to get stuck in, going as a war correspondent to Cuba, to South Africa. He was meant to be a journalist, but he still was fighting. He should have been executed under the Geneva Convention for that. So he tried to have the best of both worlds, being a journalist and being a soldier at the same time. We fought at the Battle of Omdurman, and as he wrote in his autobiography, how easy it is to kill a man. Other people might agonize over that, might have qualms of conscience, but he was not struck by any such pangs, and so it proved. He was trying to get stuck into every conflict around. When it came to the First World War, the British cabinet thought that they would stand aloof from the conflagration, but Churchill and a couple of other diehards, they cajoled the government into declaring war and wasn't willing to negotiate an early peace, things like that, which could have saved millions of lives. And it goes on, being unwilling to agree to self-determination for Ireland, that caused a conflict. The history is just replete with examples of him crossing the street to get into a fight, sending troops to interfere in the Russian Civil War, saying Bolsheviks must be strangled at birth. He expressed admiration for Hitler in about 1930 and said Mussolini was a great Roman lawgiver. And then he had warm words for Stalin and so on when he met him. He agreed to the repartition of Poland, the naughty document where they allotted Eastern European countries into one another's sphere of influence without consulting a single person from the pertinent countries. Are there any more examples? I mean, even the Second World War was avoidable with more patient diplomacy or simply being neutral, and it would have saved millions of lives. Yes, the Third Reich would have won, and yes, that would have been horrific, but it wouldn't have been as bad as 60 million deaths. And what was going on during these wars? In the First World War, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, so he was responsible for this policy of the blockade, which the United Kingdom started, not Germany, depriving the enemy populace of food. And because of this lack of comestibles and medicines and so forth, the civilian population suffered much more so than the armed forces. So hundreds of thousands of German civilians perished owing to undernourishment in the First World War. Surely that's a crime against humanity, even though the enemy did it, agreeing to things like gassing the enemy, and obviously many catastrophic misadventures such as Gallipoli. And he was obviously just a roaring alcoholic and a chain smoker. And when he was at the Royal Scots in the First World War, he avoided duty half the time. So he was a shameless self-publicist and tireless in that regard, in glad-handing the great and the good. And if the Germans were so wicked, why would you have attended German military manoeuvres only a couple of years before the First World War? It goes on like that, using gas against Iraqi rebels in the 1920s, not speaking out against slavery in some of the Allied Arab states at the time. During the Second World War, well, the bombing of Dresden when the war was virtually over, and deliberately bombing civilian areas in the Second World War, dehousing the German working class so they couldn't labour in factories, hundreds of thousands of people needlessly killed like that, not bombing the railway lines to the extermination camps, which would have saved lots of Jewish people. Let's say that the Bengal famine, foodstuffs could have been dispatched to India to save many lives. The British government was kept apprised of the situation, and despite this, he was not stricken by conscience and said, we need these comestibles for our sturdy Britishers and Australians and so forth. It just goes, the list just goes on and on over the list of horror. This man's reputation is very overblown indeed, and it's high time he was taken down a peg or two. So Churchill, although yes, he did some good things, he sometimes served a good cause, he was also wicked and proposed some causes which even at the time were recognised as unethical by many, agreeing to send back people to the Soviet Union who'd never even been born in the Soviet Union, never set foot there, knowing what fate lay in store for them. So for many, many reasons, Churchill was a wicked man. So now, on to the opposition. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the House, much of what you heard is bunkum. Churchill was a very great man indeed, and shortly before he died, he received a letter which was addressed to simply the greatest man on earth. I'm not making that up. And there was no address at all. And I'm not sure which country it was posted from, but it got to him. So he was courageous and he was merciful. I say that this motion is scurrilous and a disgrace. He was heroic, and yes, he was a flawed hero. As the Greeks would tell you, the greater the hero, the greater the flaw. He fought for moral causes, and he often spoke up for compassion and was merciful even to his deadly foes. And he helped spread parliamentary government around the world. And some of the things he did were necessary, though very distasteful, and victory would have been unobtainable without them, and just think where we would have been then. So, he had great physical courage, as even his detractors have to acknowledge. He fought in many battles, so he wasn't asking soldiers to do something he wouldn't do himself. I suppose his black dog, his manic depression, may have inspired that, because he was almost biting at the grave, eager to immolate himself on the altar of patriotic sacrifice. But he was merciful to his enemies and believed in making a generous settlement to the Boers in South Africa, to the Germans after the First World War and the Second. And he was one of the more moderate voices in regard to Germany. It's hard to understand the howls of rage and anguish at the end of the First World War. It was such a poignant moment for many families whose sons did not return. But he was a man of his era, and racist attitudes were widespread at the time, but he did grow up about it and come to believe in racial equality later on, just like he changed his mind over votes for women. We can't judge people from over a century ago by our contemporary standards, and he thought that gays should not be prosecuted when one of his Conservative MPs in the 1950s was caught cottaging in the 1950s on a cold night. He said, "Makes you proud to be British." He fought for good causes to spread parliamentary government around the world, standing out against totalitarianism. And he recognised in the Second World War he was necessitated to form an alliance with a regime which was not entirely to his liking. So moral purity is not possible in war. You're already in the area of moral compromise, because you're going to fight the enemy. And the ordinary soldiers, they're not bad people, most of them, just men who happen to be born in another country, conscripted into that army. There probably never was a conflict where one side is 100% good and the other is 100% evil, to do with the cause they're fighting for and their conduct when they're actually engaged in the armed conflict. So obviously Germany started using mustard gas first. The British responded in kind. What else was one to do? If the British didn't hit back, then the Germans were not going to desist. And this actually saved lives in the long run. And gas in those days was a very humane weapon, insofar as it only killed about 2% of people who came into contact with it. Mostly made them fall down, coughing, spluttering, maybe even bleeding from the lungs, temporarily blinded. But it didn't kill them. Very seldom killed them. So it was much less dangerous than being shot or being hit by a shell or something. So just disable them so they can be overmastered, they can be captured, and their land can be taken. So as for depriving the foe of food, well, that is a tactic as old as warfare itself. Churchill didn't invent this, and the United Kingdom clearly had advantage in terms of the Royal Navy. If they hadn't done that, Germany would have won. Would you accept that? And if you wouldn't accept that, then you must accept these tactics. It could have ended any day that Kaiser chose it to by making peace. And actually, peace feelers were put out to the other side in the First World War. But Churchill realised that unless the nemesis was comprehensively defeated, then they would just catch their breath, use it as a half-time, and come back a couple of years later. In fact, it turned out to be 20 years later. So he was a day one opposer of appeasement, and by this policy he showed he was a visionary. He was courageous. A lot of people got Mussolini wrong. He didn't seem to be that bad at the beginning. He was fairly popular, achieved some success, and he didn't abolish democracy overnight. It was piecemeal. So many people spoke out against him, and some people were gulled by Hitler. For example, he beguiled David Lloyd George, a liberal prime minister. Churchill, he spoke out against torture. That was obviously an advance. At the end of the Second World War, Stalin at Yalta spoke of executing 50,000 German officers, and Churchill said it was completely morally unacceptable. He wanted to be merciful, partly in his early sympathy with Zionism. He showed that he was very much on the side of the underdog. Indeed, one of his speeches, he said, we'll fight with absolute determination, without stinting, so forth. But he said, we will not say without mercy, because they were still going to show quarter to the enemy. He voted in favour of sending British rations to help feed German people, civilians and soldiers after the Second World War. A most exceptional and unexampled act of magnanimity. So there are many reasons to hold Churchill in high regard. And yes, he sometimes made misjudgments. And yes, he sometimes did things that were unethical. Nobody is perfect, but he must be judged in the context of the very grave decisions he had to make in this life and death struggle against an evil regime.